like to hand over to Geoff Sizer, the CEO of Genesys Electronics Design, who today is going to be talking about verification and validation. Over to you, Geoff.
Thanks, Tim, and good afternoon, everyone. Today's presentation, I will be focusing more on the verification side as opposed to the validation side, but I'll be giving references to other webinars that we've either presented to date or have planned, which give further detail on the validation aspects, but I will be touching as we go along on what validation actually involves. The screen at the moment, this is one many of you would have seen before, just as an example of a few medical devices of quite wide and varied types, all of which are subject to the medical device regulations and have requirements for verification and validation. So what's the fundamental objective of the verification and validation process? Firstly, to ensure the medical device meets the needs of the users, and that is achieved by making sure that it satisfies specifications for the device that completely and accurately reflect those requirements. It's particularly important to bear in mind that just the specification of the device doesn't necessarily guarantee that the device is going to meet the needs of the users or is going to be usable. And the interaction between verification and validation takes care of that, as I'll illustrate. We have other objectives to ensure applicable regulations are satisfied, and that in turn is part of the process of ensuring that the device meets its requirements and is safe to use. And finally, the verification validation process encompasses the manufacturing aspects to ensure the device can be manufactured repeatably and reliably so that every device meets its full specification when it comes off the production line and ends up in the hands of the user. You notice throughout the presentation that at the bottom there are some documentation references. I wouldn't bother trying to slavishly copy these down because we can make this slide deck available to anyone who wants to receive it for notification of those references.
And the recording of the presentation will be available on our website within a few days. So, yeah.
Now, it's important to distinguish the differences between the verification and validation activities for a medical device. So I've got on the screen here a couple of references that give information. Now, it's interesting that ISO 13485 does not have definitions of verification and validation, even though it uses the terms, but we can find definitions in other documents, in particular FDA documents and 60601-1 for verification. So I've put the definitions from the documents on the screen, but in italics, essentially a layman's statement. So putting it really simplistically, verification is the process of saying that the device meets a specification, and validation is the process of ensuring the device does what it needs to do. So the linkage between the two, you might think, well, of course, if it meets a specification, then it does what the user needs it to do. But that would assume that the specification is perfect. So verification may show the device meets a specification, but validation shows that that specification actually achieves what the device needs to achieve in use for its therapeutic or diagnostic function.
Geoff, I know that for verification, that you have a system specification document. Where does the validation, what do you test the validation against?
Validation normally needs to be against a validation plan, and it will define the validation activities in terms of clinical trials and user activities and usability trials, which demonstrate that the device meets the requirements of the user needs. So effectively that plan should link the user needs to the use of the device in practice, and then via a process of trialing and user tests, for example, shows that the device is actually usable in practice and achieves the outcome. So in a nutshell, the verification is a formal process that is against the device specification, and also tests defined in 60601-1, for example, whereas the validation is against a plan that needs to be constructed to provide adequate evidence via the clinical trials and usability trials process that the device does satisfy those user needs. So we'll be touching on that a little more detail as we go along.
I'm assuming that with validation, you really don't want to be waiting till the end of the project to work out that it doesn't quite do what the user expected it to do. And I know that we have user needs, and the system specification is derived from the user needs. So I'm just, am I right in assuming here that the formative usability trials, where you are really just putting it out there in front of a small number of users to, I guess, make sure that it's meeting expectations and doing what you expected it to do, and informing the summative trials later on, I guess, would I be right in assuming it's good to do that as early as possible in order to correct anything?
Yeah, absolutely. And people tend to it's a good practice, and people do tend to undertake trials with users very early on in the process. Sometimes they misname those as clinical trials. Well, they're not clinical trials in the formal sense. Preclinical evaluation is probably a term I would like to use, where you're putting the device and even the device concept and workshopping it with potential users. And it depends very much on the nature of the device. I mean, if it's a diagnostic tool used in a doctor's surgery or a clinic, that would be quite different from the use of a device in surgery, for example, or a wearable device, for example, that the patient themselves is effectively the user. So the course that you follow is very dependent on the nature of the device and what you can do that's safe. In some instances, you have issues if you're going to use the device on someone who's suffering a condition, whereas a perfectly healthy person like you and I can don it and use it and wear it as a wearable with very minimal risk, outside the scope effectively of ethics committee concerns and so forth. But nevertheless, a perfectly healthy person using a device such as a wearable can determine if it's comfortable or if it's convenient to use or to fit to put on and take off and so forth. So you can do those sorts of evaluations informally and formally throughout the process. And I guess the indicator is whenever you've got any doubt about an aspect of usability or effectiveness, to undertake some trialing processes at the earliest opportunity. And that also can follow through to a device, for example, that's a diagnostic tool. You may be able to do trialing on animals. And I do remember a situation with a cervical cancer tool of doing tests on squid skin and on pigs' cervixes, of all things, to show that the device actually can, its basic function can do some of the testing discrimination that the actual device will need. So it's a long-winded answer to say, yes, at the earliest opportunity, but be really careful not to confuse clinical trials with preclinical evaluations or informal investigations. So in terms of where verification and validation come into the picture, and we'll refer yet again to this tried and proven design controls flowchart, which shows quite clearly where the verification and validation activities are, and illustrates quite nicely the fact that verification is verifying design output, in other words, the design of the device embodied in its prototype, and verifying that against the design input, which is effectively the device technical specification. Whereas validation is taking the device when it's complete and effectively in its final form, and then making sure that that device performs and satisfies the user needs. And you'll see from the nature of this diagram that both of those processes and the flow through can be iterative. So if you, for example, are in validation of the medical device and you discover that there's some deficiency, you can cycle back to the user needs and review those. They can then impact the design inputs. So you can then cycle through the design and verification process before you then go back to repeat the clinical trials now and validation. So obviously you don't want to do this if you can avoid it, and you want any of that iteration to be incremental to the design, not fundamental to it. but nevertheless, the medical regulatory process does recognise that this type of iteration is generally necessary. And this does, once again, quite nicely emphasise the fact of the difference between verification and validation. We need to also look at the product versus process issue, because you'll find in the standards reference to verification and validation of the design outputs, i.e. the medical device, vis-a-vis the validation of processes, and generally that refers to the manufacturing process. So it is necessary to draw that distinction and realize that you have, in particular, validation not only of the device and its design and function, but also a separate process of validating the manufacturing process to demonstrate that you can consistently manufacture the device. And I'll be talking about that in a little more detail. So once again, back to one of our favorite diagrams that shows the overall end-to-end manufacturing process and all of the precursor design before that. You'll see that verification and validation come in later in the process. So this is the formal verification and validation. So the formal verification is done normally on a pilot production unit, but you can sometimes get away with doing some of it on a pre-production prototype, as long as that prototype is truly representative of the manufactured product. And the manufacturing validation, of course, can only happen once you've got manufacturing in place. So the processes occur towards the end of the design and development cycle, but the planning for it occurs right back here, back in the project planning stage. You should be planning your verification and validation, and during the course of the design, constructing your verification plans and the detailed step-by-step verification activities. I will be illustrating that with some quite detailed examples relating particularly to the electronics design and the software design, which is of course my core competence, but the same generally applies to mechanical design and physical design aspects, but I'll be using the electronics to illustrate the process. The question is, why does all this matter? From the Chief Technical Officer's perspective, verification, and in particular, really aligns with best practice engineering. Good engineering practice, there will be detailed verification of the design, irrespective of the medical device certification and compliance imperatives. So this includes detailed testing and verification of the hardware design, right down to the individual component level and circuit block level, and software designs right down to the software unit level. So that's saying every level in the hierarchy is subject to this detailed testing. You're testing for technical soundness. In other words, example is an electronic circuit, self-consistent and guaranteed to be highly robust and reliable. And secondly, does the design conform with its specified requirements and with the regulations that apply to that aspect of design? And that may include things like single point of failure avoidance and component rating adequacy and aspects of that nature. So there's a strong alignment between engineering best practice and the verification step. From a CEO's perspective, the primary driver is, if you want your device to be legally saleable on the market, then you have to go through the verification and validation activities in order to satisfy ISO 13485 quality system requirements and the requirements of the various regulators, TGA, FDA, EU, etc., all align with the requirements of ISO 13485 and the other headline regulatory standards that lead into the certification process. So in terms of the details of the QMS, ISO 13485 calls up verification and validation, and I'll be stepping through that in a little bit more detail, but you've got the document references, the headline references at the bottom of the screen there, which we'll look at in a little more detail. Tim, slow me down if I'm rushing through this too quickly.
Will do.
So having a look at the standards, it's a old friends, the headline standards with ISO 13485 and ISO 14971 as the headline, and then the applicable regulatory standards for the device that sit under that, and the fairly universal ones that will apply to any active medical device. 60601-1 for anything that's electrically powered, 6304 for anything that's got software in it, 62366 for usability, which applies universally, and many others, including things like cleanliness, sterilization, biocompatibility. There are dozens and dozens of collateral standards that are called up by 60601-1 and others that may be product specific that apply, and all of them have a verification requirement, and many of them have a validation requirement called up in those standards. So having a look in a bit more detail at the specific requirements, particularly of 13485, and I've got screen caps here of the relevant clauses, and I won't labour through these, but other than to perhaps emphasise the fact 13485 calls up design and development verification. So this is a verification of the devices as delivered at the end of the design process to show that those devices meet their design and development input requirements, i.e. their specifications. There is also a requirement to verify that the specification genuinely represents the requirement for the device, and this gets very explicit for 6304 for software, which we'll talk about in a minute, but it's implied in 13485 that you need to actually go through your specification, make sure that your specification reflects the user needs, and this is done by the traceability process, but also to make sure that it's self-consistent and logical. You don't have requirements in the specification that are actually self-contradictory that will then cause you problems. So it's important to have a structured process to not only verify the actual designs, but also to verify the specification for the design.
Can you give us an example of that, Geoff?
Well, you could have a requirement for a device must be operable from an energy source that contains no more than X joules of energy. Then you have another requirement that the device needs to operate at a certain power level for a certain number of hours, where that requires energy more than you can contain in the battery that's been specified.
But how would you prove that they're all self-consistent? Like, that's sort of common sense. And, other than sort of picking it up and going, well, do you have a clause by clause analysis of every other clause in the document? How would you do that in practice in a way that's practical?
Yeah. In effect, yes. The only tool that's useful for doing that is the wetware between your ears. It takes an experienced and competent senior engineer who is highly familiar with the entire specification to go through and do that process, so that they will know from memory when they see a requirement that is likely to conflict with some other requirement, and then cross-check it. To slavishly have a cross-reference table of every clause against every other clause becomes hopelessly over-complicated, and
I'm just wondering how you, I mean, I get what you're saying, but I'm just wondering how you actually can show that to an auditor that you've done that diligently.
At the end of the day, the auditor is going to have to put some faith in the competence of the engineer doing the work. It's the bottom line. You can't do it 100%, but there is a cross-check and balance, and normally you'll find out when you're doing your verification and validation steps, you'll find out that you meet one requirement and not the other. So there is a safety valve in it, but nevertheless, you can end up with requirements that are in conflict that sneak through to the end. And you want to really read them out right at the start. And the one I've said is a pretty obvious one that you can pick up fairly easily. You'll have some other more subtle ones, like you may have a requirement to meet a certain price point that the users can tolerate, but then you have a requirement to meet the regulatory standards, and you might find that those tend to be in conflict. So it's not an easy thing to do. You'll probably find it's fairly unlikely that an auditor will be able to go through in enough detail and pick those conflicts out, other than by seeing a conflict once you get into the verification process. So it is something you'll generally pick up in verification, but you really don't want to do that, because then you've got yourself a world of pain to fix it up at the end. So what does all this mean? Firstly, making sure technical specifications are complete, accurate and verifiable. So this means every specified clause you can objectively and explicitly demonstrate compliance by means of a test or analysis step. So you've got to be really careful that you don't have airy-fairy statements in your specification. I've seen statements that say the overall system shall meet a certain requirement, where that's dependent upon a whole heap of elements of the system, and that's in a specification for one particular element. So you can't verify the overall system compliance by looking at the verification for one particular element. You need to be really careful with those sorts of vague or imprecise specification statements that you can't verify. And so looking in a little bit more detail, testing of the device to ensure that every aspect applies with the specified requirements and regulations. That's a bit of a given. And then down to deep under the hood testing, down to electronics, hardware at component and module level. This is particularly important to make sure that components are used within ratings and that they're adequately robust, to make sure that you don't have single point of failure that will fail to meet safety requirements of 60601-1, for example. And similar for software, deep under the hood testing. So there are several layers of this. So at the highest level, it's just verifying that the design meets the specified requirement in the design input spec, but at the deeper level, to make sure that that is a sound design that will meet all of the other requirements you expect of a reliable, high quality product. When we look at mechanical parts, we get down to a whole heap of detailed tests, many of which are prescribed in 60601-1 for individual component parts and also sub-assemblies and sub-assemblies. And lastly but not leastly, verification of packaging is extremely important, particularly when you're dealing with sterilized devices or devices with sterilization-like requirements for cleanliness, to make sure that the packaging during transportation and shelf life will maintain that sterilization or cleanliness. And there are many other examples I could add to this list, but those are just a few indicators. So I won't go through the slide in detail, but it just gives a listing of some of the documents that you should be expecting to produce during. These documents should be identified and preferably at least templates created during the planning process. Then they should be fleshed out, often in parallel with the design process, because in many cases you don't know what the detail will be till you've got the design done, particularly for the electronics and the mechanical parts. But all of the different aspects of verification should have a plan, and the plan generally says, here's the sequence of activities we're going to undertake. The protocol says how we're going to do it. And at Genesys, we use a log, which is effectively the detailed document that captures all of the verification outputs. And we have two steps of that. One step is to actually define all the tests, and then there are additional columns generally in an Excel spreadsheet for the capturing of the actual results. So you start off with that document defining the detailed tests, then you use the same document or an updated version of it to capture the test results. And I'll illustrate this for an example for electronics. And you'll see I've put here different categories of verification plan. There's no rule that says you have to have separate documents for each of these, but generally you want to divide them up so that they fall sensibly with the people who are going to do the work. So you generally find you have different engineers, or in our case a different organization. One of our partner organizations doing mechanical, whereas we're doing electrical. So it makes sense to have different separate documents that are under the control of the party who's actually doing that activity. So having a look at 60601-1, it is really the Bible for the verification activities for a bit of medical electrical equipment. I'll emphasize once again, it is not just about electrical, it is about virtually every aspect of the device. The word electrical comes in because it applies to devices that have electrical power source, and that enlivens a whole heap of clauses that relate to electrical safety. But you can see from the list there that it covers a whole heap of other aspects, and in particular mechanical usability, biocompatibility, etc., and defines documentation and labeling requirements. So generally speaking, 60601 actually defines verification tests that need to be undertaken on a device to demonstrate conformance. So it's really a headline document in terms of the verification process. So no need to labour on this today. I've got the reference there to a previous webinar that goes through, takes a walkthrough through 60601-1, gives you details about what it's all about. So in terms of your 60601-1 verification, I'd refer you to that webinar. And also to note, for any design that we do at Genesys, we have 60601-1 compliance formally verified by a third-party accredited lab. We tend to use TUV in Singapore, with whom we've had very good experience, and they, for a cost of maybe the order of $30,000 will give you a 60601-1 compliance report for your product, which gives you a high degree of confidence of compliance. We insist on that for any device we're involved with, because it's your primary risk minimization activity that you're going to do for your product.
And Geoff, how does those certificates help in the medical device file and the regulatory approval process?
Yeah. Any submission you make is going to require you to demonstrate compliance with the headline standards, and 60601-1 is the master headline standard for basic safety and essential performance. So it's absolutely essential that you've got evidence of compliance against it in your medical device file and in your submission, be it your CE submission, your TGA submission, or your FDA submission for 510K, for example. All have requirements of demonstrating compliance against all these aspects. The regulators don't call up specifically 60601-1 in all cases, particularly the FDA like to have their own list, but it does align closely. So if you've got a report saying you comply with 60601-1, that gives you a clean bill of health against all of these aspects of your product in terms of the view of the regulator. And particularly when you use a recognized test lab where it's got recognized certification or accreditation for that test, it's a very, very powerful component part of your submission. So looking at 6304, and it's pretty important to look at the interaction between 60601-1 and 6304. This diagram shows it quite neatly, where the bits in green are the purview of 6304, and it specifically addresses verification of software. But in the high level compliance hierarchy of that, you have 60601-1 that specifies firstly verification of the software, and secondly it calls up 6304 for the verification aspect. So you've got this double level. And finally, 60601 also identifies the validation aspect. And I've put the PEMS and PES acronyms in there because it can get a little bit confusing. So 60601-1 deals with the equipment that has the software integrated into it from both a verification and validation perspective, whereas 6304 deals explicitly with the verification of the software component, and it does not address validation. But collectively, between those two standards, all of the ground is covered. I have come across situations where the 60601-1 aspect of software is just it's ignored or not known about, and all the focus is on 6304, but you're leaving out a particularly important part in terms of the overall requirement. Once again, I can refer you off to other webinars that give details of these specific standards. So delving a little bit more deeply into 6304 software verification, I've indicated there the various steps where verification activities are required. and it does get a little convoluted because it addresses not only the verification of the software itself, but also verification of software integration and verification of the software requirements. So those bubbles shown there on this extract from 6304 show you the various steps.
Are you going to go into the integration, how you do the verification and the integration?
I wasn't planning to talk about that in detail, but I can address it.
Because for the specification, system requirements, I can understand how that would work. You've got a numbered list of requirements, and you can verify against each specific clause and subclause and so forth. But integration is more of a process than a list of things. So how is it a to-do list? How is it? How do you do that?
Well, this next slide that shows the detailed clauses helps a little bit in explaining that. There is a requirement in 6304 to actually verify software integration under 562, and it's actually verifying the software integration process. Now, I will say that this is aimed at really big systems where you've got multiple software suites on multiple computers on a network. If you're talking about a device with an embedded microcontroller, software integration is in fact an integral part of the development process, because the software runs on the platform, so you're integrating it as you go along. And so it becomes a little bit of a redundant activity. 6304 does allow you to verify software integration as a part of the software system verification. So under 57574, where it says software system testing, you can actually do the software integration testing as a part of the software system testing. Just to comment on, for example, 5.7 versus 5.7.4, where 5.7 is the actual process of software system testing, i.e. doing all the software system tests, then 5.7.4 is evaluating the software system testing to demonstrate that the software system testing was in fact effective. So this is where you get to the wetware behind the ears of a senior software engineer to go through all of the software system tests and doing an engineering level expert assessment of saying, was that software test effective? Now, you can get from the flavor of this slide, it's going to be impossible within the scope of this webinar to start to even scratch the surface of some of this detail. So once again, I'll have to refer you on to the webinar recording that addresses 6304 in detail, where I do go to a bit greater depth on this activity. But in a nutshell, complying with 6304 in terms of verification is an onerous and complicated process, and not to be tackled in a light-hearted manner, and it does require a particular skill set of an experienced and senior software engineer with expertise in this process to have any hope to do this job, to do justice to this job. Just as a word of warning. Just looking here, I've got an extract from this is actually from a Genesys template document where we have the various documentary artifacts that are generated as a part of the 6304 compliance process. So you can see on the far left is the actual document, and in fact in this instance it's a worksheet of the overall software verification log, which does or captures the verification process of each of those verification steps. Then that is reviewed and signed off. Now, each of these checklists that you can see will be a spreadsheet worksheet consisting typically of hundreds of lines of verification activities for each of those verification processes, and I'm going to look at a couple of those in detail. So you can see that we're verifying our software verification checklist to make sure our checklist is complete. We're verifying our software requirements specification. We have to verify our software architecture. So there's a requirement to verify that your software architecture meets the requirements of the system. Software integration plan needs to be verified. Then we get down to the actual verification of the software itself. So we have to verify the unit level. So this is unit verification for input, output, and middleware. Unit verification for a high-level application. Then verification of the software system, which is these things integrated into the actual software system. We have a separate step to verify our risk measurement process, and in fact we need to validate our risk measurement, our risk measures. So if we have software that is used to mitigate risks, we actually need to validate that as a step. So this is a little bit of an exception with 6304 does talk about validation. And finally, whenever we do updates, we need to do software regression testing and verify that. And there is a whole separate set of requirements when we get into our maintenance phase for verifying software updates during the maintenance process. You can see that in this particular document that was not applicable, but when you get into software maintenance after the product's on the market, you have another whole heap of requirements that come to play. So Tim, are you completely bamboozled at this point?
No, it's perfectly clear. I'm looking forward to seeing the examples of those.
Yeah, I haven't got examples of all of these, but I've got a couple of detailed under the hood examples just to show you what some of this means. Now, there are other standards we need to worry about. 60601-1-2 is a particularly critical one for electromagnetic compatibility, and we do have a webinar planned on that, and it is
in fact,
very much oriented to verification. And we've already done one on packaging sterilization, which once again has a fairly onerous verification validation aspect to it. So I think collectively amongst these webinars that we've already held and the ones that we're planning, we will, and today is a bit of a capstone on top of those, we will have covered the overall field of play reasonably well. But if anyone on the audience has a particular concern, not only on verification and validation, but any aspect of medical regulatory compliance that they don't think we've addressed to date, by all means, let it be known that you would like to see us attack a particular topic. If we don't have the skill set in terms of in-house resources at Genesys or the other parties that we've engaged with, we can reach out and find someone who'll be an expert in that field who'll be able to do a webinar on pretty much any topic that you're likely to want to have addressed.
So I just put up the EMC webinar yesterday. It's on the 11th of August, and it's on the events page on the website, the community website.
So I'll just show you a couple of details of what we call our verification log, and this is against the electronic design input specification. So what this is doing, and this is of course a very simplified depiction of the process, takes a requirement. So we have a traceability code, electronic design input number 1, which says paragraph 2.2.1 MCU core. It says the MCU core must have a certain speed capability. So we say, here's the critical parameter, it must be at least a 50 megahertz core. How do we verify that? We're going to do that by looking at the component data sheet. We're not going to test it, we're going to verify it by referring to data. And you can see I've got a reference to the design manual, which is our electronic design manual that specifies that detailed component part that is intended to meet this requirement of the specification. So we're going to verify the MCU speed core capability against the data sheet. You'll see these columns here. This column here is a very important step. You must get this part here verified by a senior competent engineer to say, yes, that verification method is appropriate to verify that requirement. So this is verifying the procedure. It's not actually doing the verification of the component part. So once you have created this log, and you can see you'll have hundreds of rows, and I've shown here an example, electronic design input number 127 relates to the LCD, and there'll be numbers 2 through 126 in between and a whole lot after that. Maybe hundreds of rows of requirements that you need to then verify that you have a verification test to verify that parameter, and that you have signed off that that test is appropriate to achieve an adequate level of verification certainty of that parameter. And each design input may give rise to many rows in the spreadsheet. So LCD display intensity, pretty simple one, but if you have a voltage regulator and you have to verify performance of a voltage regulator, you've got a whole heap of parameters for that voltage regulator that you might need to cross-check. So you don't necessarily have one row per requirement. So having gone through the process of signing off that the verification process is appropriate, and make absolutely sure that you have in your records a signed off document with signatures on it that predates the undertaking of the tests. You can't verify the procedure after you've done the tests. You must do it beforehand. So you then have
I've got a question here, sorry, from Matt Sheedy asking, does hazard and risk analysis, i.e. ISO 14971, impact on the rigor and depth of effort you would apply to verifying and validating requirements and or the design aspects of the medical product? I'm not sure if that question was a general one or relating to this sort of, how that would get down to this level.
It absolutely does. Firstly, because your risk analysis will give rise to risk mitigation requirements that occur back in the system level, software level, electronics hardware level, mechanical level. So the risk mitigation process or risk analysis process gives rise to additional requirements, and there is an additional burden that if something is a risk mitigation measure, then it needs additional verification and validation to be undertaken to show that it's effective. So that the risk process to 14971 not only increases the number of items that need to be verified, but it increases the level of rigor of verification that you must undertake to satisfy the risk minimization process. Now, we'll refer to that very important clause in 60601-1 that says if you comply with an objective requirement that's explicitly stated in 60601-1, that indicates that you have taken sufficient risk mitigation process for that risk. So there's a very important, it's actually a virtuous cycle, not a vicious cycle, but it does give rise to additional work. I would say, as a rough guess, a third of your verification activities probably relate to 14971 requirements or derived requirements. So it has a big implication for requirements that are related to risk mitigation. Won't go into any more detail on that, but I do intend to do another webinar in the future, which will be a deep dive in hazards analysis and risk mitigation, and that'll be to supplement the higher level one we've done on 14971 that will address this interaction with the verification and validation activities. So it's just following on through this. So it's important that the verification procedure is signed off before the verification is undertaken. It's important the verification is done by an appropriately capable engineer who has been briefed and trained in the process, and that who has not been involved in the actual design that they're verifying. So they need to be independent of the actual designer who did the design work. They then need to capture the observed outcomes. And one thing we found very important is not just have the engineers say so that yes, it's an 80 megahertz clock speed, but actually to include in the verification log, or as referenced from the log, a screen cap of the data sheet with the highlighting that shows that the processor clock speed is 80 megahertz. And that applies to any of these other parameters. Always provide hard copy evidence in machine readable form that you do actually comply, and hyperlink that in to the verification log. And so, for example, if I'm doing a measurement with a light meter, I'll take a photograph of the light meter, or if it's a suitable capable device, do a capture of that evidence, so that if your auditor says, well, okay, you show that the engineer did this, how can you prove it? You actually have that evidence available to you. Some auditors won't go to that level of depth, some will, but the ones that do, it's just as easy to capture that evidence as you go along. And guess what? It makes it really easy for the person who then signs off the verification result. So after this work is done and this is recorded, you need to then have a senior engineer, in this case it's been me, go through and sign off that yes, that evidence there does demonstrate that this requirement is met. So when I'm doing this review, I'll actually go through every one of these bits of evidence and say, yes, that evidence actually does demonstrate that this test verifies that requirement. And following through the note, if you have a non-conformance, you need to identify it, assess its severity, and then propose remedial action to fix it. And this occurs at every step in the process, even if you're doing it's best to pick this up in pre-compliance. So if you pick up non-conformities in your formal compliance process, open up a world of pain, because you then have to cycle back through this whole process for that requirement, and then also make sure that whatever you've done to fix this requirement hasn't broken something else. So if you start, when you're doing your formal verification, to start to come up with non-conformances, it really is a nightmare. We've done a moderately complex device where I think we had 2 or 3 non-conformances in formal verification. That probably spawned about a man-week of work to fix. So best if it doesn't happen.
Yeah, I've got another question here.
Yep.
Yeah, I've got another question here, which is asking whether you have any comments on the use of specialized software / issue tracking systems, such as Jira or Azure DevOps, to write and then track the verification plan and log.
If they're used carefully, it can be done effectively. I personally don't like it, because when I'm doing this review process here, if I have to go to separate screens in Jira to trace through this process, firstly, that process of having to go things means it's not all there in front of me. I'd rather have all this available to me in a spreadsheet on a large monitor, so I can look at the whole lot and see the whole lot before me when I'm doing this verification. The other important thing is, by having a spreadsheet with all of the requirements identified in it, I can get a big picture view of the overall scene. So if I'm seeing I've got this requirement and I've got 7 different tests to verify against this requirement, I can have all of those 7 tests before my eyes and go through them and review them on one screen. Whereas using a system like Jira to do that, you don't end up with all that in your face at the same time. Now, that's a personal preference thing. Some people do prefer a sort of a structured database or a Jira type approach to the problem. To a degree, it's personal preference, but beware that you don't end up with an automated tool that actually hides detail or leads you down to a checkbox mentality approach rather than a really considered detailed review approach. So it's probably pretty effective just for the process of capturing the results, but in terms of reviewing those results and in terms of reviewing these review steps, I think it probably detracts from. So Tim, is that sufficient clarity on that?
Yes, I believe so. Now you've got about 8 minutes left, so I'm not sure how many slides you got left, but
I've got a few slides, but I'll move through them. So here's a similar thing, and this is I won't labor on this one, but this is a much more detailed down under the hood assessment. So this isn't directly assessing a circuit module against a specified requirement and specification. It's actually saying, here I have a circuit module for a voltage regulator, and does that voltage regulator meet all the requirements that it needs to meet to be an effective voltage regulator? So in this case, I've gone through and shown the process of determining that voltage regulator has adequate capacity to deliver the specified current at the appropriate voltage level, maintaining regulation and with adequate performance. And in this instance, for a voltage regulator, I'd probably have 8 or 10 other tests for that voltage regulator, looking at things, obviously its input and output regulation, having a look at its ripple, having a look at its transient performance, its load transient performance, its line transient performance, etc., doing cross screen caps and voltmeter and ammeter caps to show that voltage regulator is doing what it's supposed to do to work as a voltage regulator. And you'll note, very important thing to note here, make sure all of this testing is done with calibrated test equipment. And here I've shown another example. We've got a flash memory that's SPI interfaced. Many engineers attempt to say, though, if the device works and the memory works and the SPI bus is fine, tick, everything's good. If you're going to do thorough verification of that device, you will look down at the detail of the SPI bus. So is that SPI bus operating effectively? So the rise and fall times of all the signals within the specification for SPI when using that bus for the specification of the devices that are on that bus. Once again, for SPI, you look at rise and fall times. You'd also look at signal logic level times, and obviously you're going to look at the functionality. Does the device actually work and do what it's supposed to do? So once again, I would say for a circuit schematic of 8 or 10 pages, expect to have 300 or 400 rows in a spreadsheet. For a complex device of 20 or 30 pages of schematics, expect to have 1,000 rows in a spreadsheet to properly verify that that electronics is fully functional. And I'll skip through pretty quickly, Tim. Here's just an example for software that shows, and the headings in the spreadsheet, they're sort of somewhat simplified from the ones we actually use, but they give the idea. And once again, we have the flavor here. This is showing verification of software against a requirement. And this is pretty simple. Does it meet 62304? That's purely by analyzing the documentary artifacts. But here's one example. The device is single use. So how do you make sure the device is single use? So you have a lockout that after it's been used, you prevent it from being reused. So the test is say, take the device through a normal use cycle and show that the reuse lockout is effective after that process. So once again, we take the clause, we specify the verification process against the clause. We then review that and sign off that that verification is acceptable. We then have an engineer to go through and run the test and capture the results, once again with evidentiary outcomes by way of photographs or references to documents. We then sign off that this verification process and these results actually demonstrate verification against these tests. One thing to note, it's important that the pass-fail criteria for the test are objective. In other words, we have something we can say definitively. And slipping back to the other slide, it's pretty straightforward for these things. We have to say it meets a certain requirement. So the objective is a numerical expression, and then we make sure the measured values meet that specified requirement. In the case of software, once again, we have an objective measure. What do we do to show that that software meets the requirement? And then we test against that. We record those results, and then once again, a senior competent engineer will sign off against those requirements. And for anyone who is curious, I am in fact a qualified electronics engineer. I am in fact a qualified software engineer, so I can wear hats in both these domains. So that's sort of a bit of a whirlwind tour through the process. These will be available in the slide deck, so I hope they'll give you a little bit of an indicator on how to go about constructing these logs to specify the tests and record the data. So design and development validation, and I will slip through pretty quick here, Tim, through these validation aspects. It's, as I mentioned before, saying, does the device actually meet the needs of the users? So this 12485 gives you the guidelines to how to do that. And effectively, particularly important, the second paragraph, document validation plans. It includes the methods, acceptance criteria, and appropriate statistical techniques, blah, 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 for the validation activity. So this gets down to answer a question, Tim, about how do you ensure validation? And that is by having effective validation plans and protocols, and then having people of appropriate expertise review and sign off and say that, yes, if you do that validation activity, then that will give you sufficient weight of objective evidence to show that the validation process validates the device or the product or the system. Once again, what does it mean? Ensuring that the device meets need for safety, performance and usability by demonstrating that process in actual use. And this is normally done by the clinical trials process. I will admit that this is getting outside of my comfort zone of competence in terms of the subtleties behind this. We do have other webinars on the process. So if there's anyone out there who claims core expertise in the clinical validation process and would like to share the wealth of their knowledge with us, and by all means make that known and we can organise a webinar.
Sure, and we have had 2 webinars, one on clinical trials which was on the 10th of March, and that was with Suzanne Williams from Mobius Medical. And we also had one on usability engineering on the 2nd of September last year, and that was with Sue Lynch from MedTech Pathways. So yeah, if you want to know more about this area, just go to the recordings page of the community website.
Yeah, so I will refer to those two presentations for further details on the validation aspects of the product. So just to talk very briefly about process validation, and this covers off processes, for example, things that go on in biology laboratories and so forth and so forth. But in the case of an active MedTech device, it generally refers to the manufacturing process. So you're validating the process of manufacturing the device, but you'll notice it does have the service provision component down the bottom. Once again, the service provision aspect is kind of outside the scope to a degree of what this community is focusing on, but it is a very important part of the whole medical scene. But we tend to focus on it on active medical devices, where the main validation process is the manufacturing. So I won't labour further on that slide, but effectively in validating a manufacturing activity, you're providing evidence that devices, 100% of the devices meet their requirements. It's particularly important to note that this comes into play where you can't do 100% verification. So if you can do 100% verification testing of something, you arguably don't need to validate the manufacturing process for that, although generally you tend to do so. Where it really comes into play is where you can't actually do testing of every aspect of the device without destroying it. For example, I can't test a sterilization barrier without opening it up and seeing if there's been biological contamination inside. So by definition, I can't do 100% testing of my packaging. Otherwise, I'll destroy the packaging and doing the testing. So in that instance, you have recourse to show that the process that you're using is sufficiently robust to generate and guarantee the result. You would usually do this by some form of pre-test. So you might run a batch of 100 units and show that you get 100% success rate of sterilization, destroying those units in the process. And you may then back that up in manufacturing by doing a batch sampling, an AQL type process where you maybe take 5% of units off every batch, and then if no more than one of those fails, you say it's okay, or whatever your AQL level is. Generally for an electronics assembly, what you'll be doing is taking the assembly process and then the end-of-line production test process and doing a validation step to show that that end-of-line production test process on your electronic circuit board and sub-assembly is effective. So you can't rely on the fact that your end-of-line production test jig is perfect. You have to actually validate that it is testing things properly. And one way to do that is to put seeded faults into units, so deliberately introduce faults in critical areas in the circuit by putting in wrong components or leading components off or adding short circuits, for example, and then validating that your end-of-line production test jig is picking those up. Finally, an important step, wherever you're using software, you need to validate that use of that software in your process. And this applies to your production, but also any software you use in your quality system. So these are new requirements in 13485, and the particular areas to be concerned about that auditors will look at. If you've got formulas in Excel spreadsheets, for example, doing statistical calculations or even just adding things up, adding up columns, then you have to validate that that Excel spreadsheet is in fact working. Now, curiously, the quality process assumes that human beings doing arithmetic are always 100% perfect, and Excel spreadsheets doing arithmetic are always 100% imperfect. But that's another discussion. So manufacturing process validation, we really haven't addressed this in this webinar series, so it's another thing that we will be looking at, finding an expert in the manufacturing process to take us through what validation really means in that area.